And for more on Mr. Blinken's meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, we're joined by Glaser. She's the managing director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund. Ms. Glaser, we've been running the story all afternoon here in Singapore, President Xi's meeting with Mr. Blinken. But in fact, we could not have taken for granted that this meeting was going to happen at all. As a barometer of US-China ties, that Mr. Blinken could meet Mr. Xi again this time, as he did in June last year, what does that say about the current state of US-China ties?
I think it signals that China's leader, Xi Jinping, wants to have greater stability in the US-China relationship, that he still values the meetings that he's having with U.S. President Biden. He referred back to their last meeting in November at Woodside and the understandings that they have reached. Xi Jinping has developed this phrase of the San Francisco vision, referring back to that summit. So I think it does signal that Xi Jinping wants to continue to try to build cooperation in this relationship, but of course also express his own concerns that he has about the U.S.-China relationship. He particularly warned that competition between the two countries is not a bad thing, but it should not be a zero-sum game. And he also warned that the U.S. should not be building coalitions against China. And of course, that's a reference to recent meetings between the U.S. and Japanese and Filipino leaders and other meetings that have taken place where the United States and its allies are working together to protect their interests.
If we read between the lines then of what Mr. Xi has said and Mr. Wang Yi has said as well in the last 24 hours, do we see enough interest, as you say, in wanting stable ties, in building cooperation for China to make any concessions on its assistance to Russia, which was one of Mr. Blinken's express aims this time on this trip to Beijing?
Well, I think that is really the question of the hour, because it was front and center for Secretary of State Blinken in his meetings with Chinese officials. The United States continues to say that we don't see China selling weapons to Russia, but we see components and machine tools, dual-use equipment, and it has enabled Russia to reconstitute its defense industry and continue to prosecute the war against Ukraine. And importantly, as Blinken said, potentially pose a threat to Europe. And I see no sign so far in the readouts that the Chinese have said that they're willing to take action. But of course, what matters is what they do, not what they say. And there have been reports that the United States is considering imposing sanctions on Chinese banks that are engaging in these financial transactions with Russia. There are some regional banks in China that no longer rely on the US dollar, and they would not be affected by such sanctions. But big Chinese banks would, and they would not want to lose their access to the US dollar. So I think that this is a warning shot. And importantly, Blinken said if China does not take action, then the United States will. That's a very clear statement.
All right. If we want to stress, it doesn't matter what you say, but in fact what you do. The US earlier this month releasing what was previously classified information, I suppose, to give heft to these claims about Chinese aid to Russia. So, for example, 70% of machine tools in the last quarter of last year coming from China, 90% of chips that make tanks, missiles and aircraft in Russia coming from China in the whole of 2023. So this is what the US is prepared to do. Is there anything China can do implicitly in a possibly face-saving way that meets US expectations, but it does not actually have to say anything about what it's doing?
Well, certainly China doesn't have to say anything. I imagine that Putin in Russia is going to be interested in continuing this flow of assistance from China. So I think the big question for Xi Jinping is whether he is willing to take actions that might in some way harm his relationship with Putin. But we will see going forward. The United States is able to track a great deal of these transactions, the capabilities that we see going to Russia. It really started in early 2023, so a year after the war started, and it has increased massively over the last year. Our export controls on Russia, which many countries have been implementing, we were seeing them having some effect in the year after the war. That completely reversed in 2023. So we will see going forward whether or not the Chinese agree to curtail these kinds of exports to Russia.
All right, Ms. Glaser, you mentioned Europe earlier on your answer. Now, Europe is another way in which the U.S. can enlist help to bring pressure to bear on China. Mr. Blinken mentioning meeting NATO allies, G7 countries in the last week, and he stressed that fueling Russia's abilities on its defense industrial base does not just threaten Ukraine, it threatens Europe as well. So gently suggesting to Europe that it can use economic tools on China, which is something China has been concerned about. Do you see, following Olaf Scholz's visit to Beijing last week, do you see Europe actually stepping up to put that kind of pressure on China?
Well, I don't think we saw any signs of that during Chancellor Scholz's visit to Europe, but indeed, I do think there are growing concerns in the EU. Some actions have been taken. I believe that 3 Chinese entities have already been sanctioned. Yes, there's more that Europe can do. They can name more Chinese entities. But of course, if the United States were to go ahead with the imposition of financial sanctions, banks around the world would immediately support those sanctions because they would not want to be cut off from the U.S. dollar. I don't expect that Europe would take its own financial sanctions, but I do think that they could take sanctions against more Chinese entities that are supplying these dual-use components and semiconductors and all of the things that are fueling Russia's capability to prosecute the war and rebuild its defense industry.
And a final question, Mr. Glaser, because you were in Taiwan last month meeting the president-elect who will be inaugurated in just over 3 weeks from now. Now, in the delegation, speaking to you, Lai Ching-te mentioned that his main political task is maintaining the status quo in Taiwan, I suppose in terms of relations, cross-strait relations as well with Beijing. Do you see his repeating of maintaining the status quo being enough to keep the lid on tensions across the Taiwan Strait? Final answer.
I think that many countries are going to be watching closely what the president-elect, William Lai, says when he is inaugurated on May 20th. And yes, I expect that he will say that he commits to preserving the status quo, which is peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, at least from the U.S. perspective. But what he says, Chinese will not be satisfied. They would like him to say that Taiwan is part of China. That's not going to happen, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there will be crisis after the inauguration. I think that William Lai will be focused on many issues at home. He has to address the concerns of the Taiwanese citizens. He wants to preserve good relations between Taiwan and the international community, including the United States and Singapore. And I think that if he were to disrupt the peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, then it would be difficult for him to continue to strengthen his ties with the international community. So I suspect that William Lai will continue many of the policies that his predecessor, current President Tsai Ing-wen, has implemented over the last 8 years.
And we'll see if that is sufficient to keep the peace across the strait. Thanks for that. Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund.